And I'd like to welcome Andrew Campling from 419 Consulting. And his talk is on Encrypted Client Hello, so ECH and network operators.
Anyway, yeah, so this is looking at the other end of the ecosystem. I suppose if I was to subtitle this, it might be just because you can doesn't mean you should. So perhaps I'll plant that seed at the start. It's based on some discussions with a range of network operators on their take on the implications of ECH for their network operations. For those of you that were paying attention at the last IEPG meeting in Vancouver, this is an edited, slightly updated version of that talk, so you'll experience some sense of deja vu, but with some updates. And really, I guess just for sort of context, since we've been talking about ECH, just as a reminder, the intent is to give more privacy. There are arguably some unintended consequences of the deployment. And that's largely what we're going to sort of touch on, but specifically looking at that from a network operator's point of view. So thinking about where ECH is deployed, or the problem it's trying to solve, which is to encrypt the SNI for privacy purposes. It's worth bearing in mind that for enterprises, that potentially has a significant downside, not least of which if they're in a regulated industry, and if any of you have been paying attention to regulations, that's an awful lot of enterprises are in regulated industries, particularly if you look at, for example, the most recent DORA and NIS2 regulations. There are some expensive consequences if they're not blocking access effectively to malicious content. As an example, some finance sector enterprises were each fined $200 million, a total of $2 billion by the US regulator because they weren't providing a 100% audit trail of all inbound and outbound communications on their enterprise networks. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because some of their more enterprising traders were taking active steps to block the monitoring so they could do some insider trading. But despite that, it was their employers that got fined. Some of the other issues, and then I move on to the sort of network operators. Bring your own device typically uses transparent proxies and needs access to the SNI data. And frankly, a lot of enterprise firewalls, SNI data is a key indicator of compromise. And it's yet another one potentially being encrypted, which is certainly a concern for the a lot of the key cyber security companies. Similarly for schools, just to briefly touch on that, in the UK and the US, I think this is true in many other markets, but I have less knowledge of those. They have an absolute requirement to operate effective content filtering, and again, this often takes advantage of both DNS data and SNI data to do so, and if that's encrypted, that means that they won't be meeting their sort of regulatory obligations, which is clearly a concern. Now, specifically thinking about network operators, they often use the SNI data for their traffic management and their traffic steering. So that's a concern for them, that it will impact on their ability to manage their networks, and on the radio side, so on the mobile side, to do the traffic optimization, and more generally, if you like, the capacity management. So their sort of conclusion at the moment is if ECH is widely deployed, and we'll come back to that in a moment. It will make their operational support more complex than it has been and arguably needs to be. Depending on the markets, if you have zero-rated content, that typically uses the SNI data to do the zero rating. Now, zero rating isn't something which is done in all markets, so it depends what geography and whether that matters. But typically, it's most important to the least affluent customers where they've got data caps. And they may well find that they're eating into their data allowance without realizing it if ECH is deployed or activated on their browser. It's not something that the network operator can do anything about. And as I say, it typically will impact the least affluent customers. More generally, perhaps more significantly, parental controls often use either DNS or SNI, or typically a combination of the two, to do content filtering. That's quite a significant concern. And typically this will be used in the consumer market where there's not a very high level of knowledge of things like the DNS, let alone SNI, let alone things like ECH. So if, as was planned originally, a browser shipped with ECH enabled by default and not being user configurable, that might suddenly automatically bypass parental controls without the sort of parent having any realization that it was being bypassed. One of the solutions to that potentially that's being talked about by some of the network operators is they move to a so-called enterprise browser solution, where for those customers that want to use parental controls, they ship a custom browser for them, which is heavily configured, and all the controls are locked down, all the different settings. Whether that's a desirable thing depends on your point of view, but that's the sort of steps that they're currently thinking about to ensure that things like content filtering remain effective. And broadly speaking, the same really applies for where network operators are providing services to enterprise customers. They typically provide network protection services, and it's similar consequences for them in terms of if those services become a lot less effective. So they'll either exit those markets or they look at perhaps much more far-reaching solutions, which may go as far as blocking access to certain IPs where the where things like encrypted DNS operators are providing services. So a much more constrained solution set. And then finally, and depending on your point of view, this is either a bug or a feature, a lot of network operators in different markets have got legal obligations to work with law enforcement agencies for lawful intercept. They also are required to block access to CSAM and other illegal content, and are very concerned that they won't be able to meet those legal requirements if ECH is widely deployed. So what we're seeing is increasingly that the operators are starting to engage with their supplier base and really audit the supplier's knowledge of ECH and whether they've actually locked down their software and their services. So it's really starting to go into the into their supply base and starting to talk to their regulators if they believe they can't meet their regulatory obligations. We are working on a draft, by the way, for the ITF on this to really highlight the use cases where there is potentially an adverse effect of ECH. In terms of current status, I'll just do this real quick. we're still expecting the ECH draft to go through to become a standard, but it seems to be held up on the working group last call for some considerable time. In fact, there was some discussion on the TLS mailing list recently. It is nevertheless deployed by Chrome, Firefox, and Boring SSL, and also by Cloudflare. Configurable on the paid-for tiers, but I believe not so on the free tiers. And you may have seen some stuff in the press at the back end of last calendar year where there were some problems being caused where the Russian regulator began blocking any sites with ECH enabled, which caused a flurry of discussion by Cloudflare clients who were providing services to sort of Russian users, because basically they were being blocked if they were running on the free tier. So they were pushing to have it user configurable so they could disable it to continue to provide service. And there's some links there if that's of interest to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And please, if anybody has questions, come to the mics or ask remotely.
Ben Schwartz, Meta. I am a great proponent of Encrypted Client Hello, and so it will come as no surprise that I disagree with a number of the ideas put forth here. In particular, I want to point out that, in my view, a lot of these concerns are built on a small number of, I think, real technical misunderstandings about the nature of TLS SNI. In particular, the TLS SNI is not a signal that can be trusted in any way by an intermediary. Endpoints to a connection speaking TLS can forge the SNI with or without encrypted client hello. It is not authenticated to an intermediary. So if you trust it, then any attacker who wants to mess with your system can falsify it. And another important point here is that even in the absence of any attacker, correctly functioning systems do not normally disclose all of the information you're looking for in the TLS SNI. In particular, web browsers normally reuse connections across all of the names that are present in the certificate, but the TLS SNI will only indicate one of those names, whichever name was initially requested. And so on CDNs, it's common to have a single certificate that covers many different unrelated customers. And so if a connection is established to one of those customers, that's what you'll see in the SNI. And then if connections are established to the other ones, that will never be visible in clear text in TLS. And that has always been the case ever since the introduction of SNI.
Just on your first point, because that's come up often, that you shouldn't rely on the SNI. Most of the enterprise cybersecurity software uses various steps to triangulate that. Read our draft, it's covered in there. To take too long to explain here, but yeah, that's been raised, but that's understood, and it's still used by a lot of the enterprise cybersecurity software.
There's a lot of bad enterprise software out there.
I guess one of the things that's probably worth thinking about is, certainly in the ITF community, there aren't many cybersecurity people there, unfortunately. Most of the cybersecurity companies aren't present.
Yeah. So,
We out of time?
further comments on that as well is that, many of the cybersecurity Paul Adair, Infoblox. Many of the cybersecurity companies out there are offering the options to block this as a part of their software, ECH in particular, whether you like it or not. And so I would suggest perhaps for future OARC meetings, perhaps some study of that in relation to Cloudflare, who's adopted this pretty heavily. It might be interesting to see what impact that's having on the standard. The other request would be, this has enumerated a problem that many enterprise customers have in blocking this traffic. Is there more work we can be doing in IETF to find a way to bridge this gap on security and privacy?
So leaning to the mic a bit more, it wasn't very
Sorry. So what kind of client behavior do we expect when we look at this from a network operator perspective, especially, say, malware or school children? Do we expect them to like only use standardized solutions mostly and basically don't deploy anything to circumvent it? Because if so, is there a meaningful difference between standardized and non-standardized ways of basically bypassing the client SNI inspection, basically?
Well, that's why I said I think some of the companies now are looking to deploy what you are often called enterprise browsers, which are heavily tailored with locked down features to make it not possible to bypass.
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time. I want Jared to be the last question. And again, we have a break coming up, and so everybody's welcome to come talk to Andrew and have further discussions. So Jared?
Jared Mach, representing myself, especially for this purpose. There is a big difference in this is a comment, right? There's a big disjoint within the internet standards community between transport integrity, transport privacy, as well as what actual, like a secure transport looks like. And people conflate one with the other far too much right now in the wake of some surprise that the IETF community had about government activities, over a decade ago. And we still haven't recovered from that PTSD in the IETF. And this is causing a lot of things to show up, which are good technical ideas, but I think, as you mentioned, is outside of the actual straightforward end user experience. Because my laptop is owned by my company, not by me. And my expectation of privacy on that is pretty close to zero. And the privacy aspect of that is very different than my personal laptop in my bag. And the IETF community hasn't quite grappled with this because it is difficult to have the conversation in a way that is not wholly dismissive of the other side. And we need to figure out a good way to have this conversation, because in routing protocols where I primarily hang out, we need transport integrity, but the privacy, we publish similar to a DNS tap or whatever type feed of all of the data. And we need that for the same reasons why you would need it, for diddle or anything else. And this is a significant gap between the web, and specifically the HTTP portion of the IETF, and the rest that have other applications that are just as valid and have good use cases as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew.